Welcome back, everyone. Today we're doing a solo cast, and I'm going to be running through a mastermind on how to reprogram your mind. So how to break through negative thought patterns, ruminating, overthinking, and how to change that to think more positive. And so before we begin, I get a lot of doubt and skepticism from people on whether or not they can change. Very common, very often, my coaching clients will say to me, Chloe, I'm 45, been this way for my entire life. I can't change. It's just how I am. And to that, I always say, anyone can change. You can start over at any moment, any second, any day. Maybe really good but negative example of this is where we see instant change is trauma, right? One assault, one death, someone goes to war. In an instant, the mind can maladaptively rewire for PTSD, fear, what have you. But if it can maladaptively rewire, then it can adaptively rewire also, right? There's so much power to be unlocked within the mind and the nervous system. So let's first start by talking about the default mode network. So this is a network in your brain that is basically active when we are daydreaming, our mind's wandering, we're thinking of the past, the future. Basically, it's active when we are not focused on a task. When we are focused on a task, your brain's either in the default mode or the task positive mode, task positive network. So when you're in the task positive network, you're focused on a task, your mind's not really wandering. But when it comes to anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, very often this default mode network is in overdrive. So it's often hard for us to switch out of this default mode. And then these habits of thinking are deeply ingrained. And so our brain doesn't like to work really hard. So our brain likes to repeat patterns. It takes less energy to repeat the same pattern. And so unfortunately, these patterns get deeply engraved. But that's okay. We can disrupt that. So how do we disrupt this and reprogram the mind? In my opinion, we have to, first of all, change the programming. And there's a number of ways you can do this. But what you want to do is start repeating thoughts and actions that start changing what your thoughts default to. Because if you are having these strong, negative, disempowering thoughts all the time, you can start changing that so that your mind defaults to positive thinking, defaults to empowering thoughts. It's possible. It truly, truly is. So one way I suggest people start with is leveraging theta states. So when you just get out of bed, before you go to sleep at night, or when you come out of meditation or breath work, your brain is in a state called theta, which is the state between sleeping yet awake. And this is where your brain is more susceptible to programming and new thoughts. I always say never waste a theta state. When you're getting out of bed in the morning, do not check your phone. Use that time, that lucid time, to think about how good your day is going to go, how you're proud of yourself. Do a gratitude list, because this is the juicy time where you can reprogram your brain. And very often, just saying affirmations isn't enough, because we have to get the nervous system on board. And this is where I find in my coaching, people really struggle with affirmations, because they say, oh, I'm repeating, like, I'm happy, I'm abundant, and it's not really sinking. And it's because your nervous system isn't on board with it. So one way to get your nervous system on board with affirmations is to use EFT tapping. And so when you're trying to reprogram a new thought in, I have a tapping process called the fear to love method. So for an example, if you're wanting to change to abundant thinking, you can start tapping on, I am safe to receive abundance. I am safe receiving large amounts of money. It is normal for me to receive large amounts of money. And so what this tapping process will do when you're tapping on these meridians, it will actually calm the amygdala, relax the nervous system so it doesn't have this tension and almost like physical rejection to these new thoughts and ideas. And this is how you expand the capacity of the nervous system, because now your nervous system and your subconscious mind won't reject the idea. It'll calm down to the idea of this new thing, of this new concept, and then you can actually rewire it in. So as you're tapping with these new affirmations, when you're saying something new to yourself, you want to repeat it and just keep tapping until you no longer feel any tension in the body and your body feels calm to the idea. So we'll start with safety, right? We just started with safety. I feel safe to receive. And then we'll go to worthiness. I feel worthy of receiving massive amounts of wealth. I feel deserving being a millionaire, what have you. And then we want to make an identity shift once our nervous system's calmed down to this new idea. I am the type of person that finds abundance everywhere. I am a millionaire. I am a successful entrepreneur. And then finally, we shift to love. I love being abundant. I love being a business owner. You get the idea. So that's the Fear to Love EFT tapping method. And then you can also use visualization. It's such a powerful tool because your brain doesn't know the difference between real or imagined. There are actually studies on this where they've monitored the brains of professional athletes and found that the same brain regions lit up whether or not the athletes were just visualizing their sport or doing and completing that task, or whether they were actually doing it. So the same neurons are firing. I really like visualizing my future self, acting as if it's already happened, it's already here. And then I like walking through my day or my life as my future self. Okay, so how does this version of me think? What thoughts are going through her head? And also, how is she dealing with negativity when it comes up? And that's really helpful to put these neural networks in place to reprogram your mind and have a game plan already baked in. Okay, I know negativity is going to come up. I know I'm going to feel self-conscious or self-doubt at some point during the day, but this is how I'm going to handle it. And so really working with those theta states is really beautiful using EFT tapping. Something I've also used to program in new states that everyone's always very curious about and sometimes very skeptical is working with plant medicine and psychedelics. Now, there's a number of other tools that can help you reprogram your mind. A really cool one is using your environment. So we actually have place cells. They're cells in the brain that fire based on your physical location, meaning that your environment can reinforce your emotional state. So you can redecorate your space or create zones that help train your nervous system for a new behavior. And maybe if you're having trouble changing your behavior, sometimes even just rearranging your apartment, changing your wardrobe, that's something that can actually physically help you step into a new behavioral. And so maybe you want to make a subconscious shift of, hey, I'm somebody that wants to now identify as a content creator. Let's set up my desk. Let's have an area that's designated for filming and content creation. And every time I'm at that spot, I create content and I post, and I'm creating this physical association in my brain, like, hey, this is my content creation station in this physical location. I am a content creator. And this is also the same reason why sometimes stepping out of your environment can also be really helpful to make changes. You don't necessarily have to move somewhere else. Sometimes it's helpful because maybe you act a certain way in the hometown that you grew up in. I do think it's really important to leave your hometown. I think everyone should, at least for a little while. But if you can just even go to a new coffee shop, say you're wanting to reprogram in some new beliefs, think about a problem in a different way. Sometimes it's just helpful to walk a different route or go to a different coffee shop or a new restaurant somewhere you've never been. And that can really help to also reprogram the subconscious mind. So using your location is really important. And one of my favorite topics that gets a lot of interest and a lot of skepticism is how to use psychedelics to reprogram your mind, because this has been a really, really powerful tool for me. It's not necessarily for everyone, so definitely do your research beforehand. But how psychedelics work is they help to quiet the default mode network. So essentially, we have this network in our brain that is active when our mind is wandering, we're daydreaming, we're thinking about ourselves, but it's the state when we're not focused on a task. And very often when it comes to anxiety, ADHD, OCD, depression, we have these deeply ingrained negative beliefs. So this default mode network is particularly active. So I have ADHD and anxiety. And in the case of ADHD, it's also very hard to switch from default mode to the task positive network. So when you switch out of default mode, this is when you're focused on a task. So with ADHD, it's often difficult to make that switch. Now, what psychedelics can help us do is relax this default mode network, so we can create new beliefs. And there's a number of scientific ways in which psychedelics help with this process. So first of all, there is the calming of the amygdala. So your amygdala is your center in your brain that's responsible for fight or flight. Very often in trauma, anxiety, you have an overactive amygdala. And that's why sometimes in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's difficult to talk through trauma when you are sober, because your brain has this fear response, so you shut down. That was always my problem with therapy. But with psychedelics, there's a calming that happens. And so you are able to talk about and work through and process these difficult emotions. And what's really interesting with psychedelics is it changes how we process information. So when you think of the brain is a prediction machine. It is always predicting what's happening next based on our past. And so we call this top-down processing. So we're making predictions on our future based on the past, and we have these really rigid structures of how we think things are going to go. But it's really interesting with psychedelics, there's this bottom-up processing. So it actually changes the way in which you are processing information. So instead of it going from the mind to the body, it's almost like you are processing something for the first time, and it happens bottom up. So it's almost like you're feeling it through the body, and there's a number of different ways and connections it can get back to the brain. So there's different possibilities of how you're going to process it. And so you may look at the situation in a completely different way, which is incredible. And so this is where people have these profound perspective shifts of, I couldn't see that situation a different way, or how the situation was actually helping me, or this helped me to completely reframe the trauma that I went through. And so that's what's happening with psychedelics, is you're completely processing it in a different way and having new connections. And so the third way that psychedelics are really helpful for reprogramming is that you have a lot of brain regions that are now speaking to each other that normally would not be speaking to each other. So there's a lot of neural connections. But there was a study done that showed the neural connections of a brain on psilocybin versus a brain not on psilocybin. And it is insane, all the connections and pathways that are lighting up when you're on psilocybin. So I love using this analogy. People find it really helpful. Imagine your brain is like an office. You have marketing, legal, sales. Sometimes they talk to each other, sometimes they don't. But when you take psychedelics, it's like throwing an office Christmas party. So all of a sudden, all these brain regions are talking to each other. Sales, marketing, legal, they're all gathering together and they're speaking to each other. And then once the psychedelics wear off, maybe Sandra from sales will see Dave from marketing, and they'll actually remember that new connection. So that's neuroplasticity, that's rewiring of the brain, and psychedelics facilitate that. So that's basically how you can use psychedelic and plant medicine to rewire the brain. This usually happens more so on large doses, but I've been working with microdoses for a long time, and I have found this helpful to just soften the rigidity when I feel I'm having days where I just can't get out of my head and I'm constantly ruminating. Okay, so those are my favorite ways to reprogram the mind. We've got using theta states, right? EFT tapping, affirmations, visualization work. We have using our environment, and then we also have psychedelics. Now, the last part of reprogramming, when you want to make changes, is to disrupt the pattern or disrupt the default mode network when this negative thinking happens. And so the best way to do that, in my opinion, is through movement. Anytime I catch myself ruminating, getting lost in thoughts, spiraling, I'm like, okay, eject button, move. Because if you start moving, like exercising, walking, I even recommend like shaking. Just shake it out. Honestly, like bad thoughts, shake it off, because that will shift your brain immediately from the default mode network to the task positive network, which is your brain network that's responsible for focus. You cannot be in both. So once you shift into that focus network, it's a lot easier to control your thoughts. And so what I will do is, okay, I'm ruminating, I'm in my head, I'm like spiraling, looping. I just need to get out of my head into my body. I will put on my runners and go for a run or a long walk, or just start shaking or EFT tapping, anything to make the switch. And then once I'm feeling calmer, clearer, then I can move forward and change my thoughts and basically go back to step one. Like, okay, like I was ruminating. Now let's start thinking like the person I want to be. And so movement really helps to bridge that gap. There's one extra tool that I forgot about that's really, really helpful, and that's journaling. There's a muscle-mind connection that happens when you are journaling. I really like using journaling as a tool to implement new affirmations and have a change in programming. So that's one of my other favorite tools is journaling. An amazing journaling tool you can do is a day in the life of my future self. What does that look like? Where am I? What am I doing? What thoughts am I thinking? And how am I handling negativity or when chaos comes out? And just journaling that out. And it's helpful to also look through that on a daily basis, and just keep coming back to that. And that's helpful for reprogramming your mind as well. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that was helpful. Remember, so number 1, change the programming. And number 2, interrupt the negative programming that happens. You've got this. You're amazing. You can do anything that you want to in life. You just have to believe in yourself and go for it. Until next time, thanks everyone.